Part 4 of our 5-part NASM study guide series covers all of chapters 13 through 20, where we finally get to dive into the X's and O's of training people in the gym. All the material up until this point has been focused on a foundational understanding of how the body functions and how it moves. Now we get to dive into how to coach it. With that in mind, as you make your way through the companion study guide after you're done with this video, make sure and spend some time with the more practical videos and resources that we've included for you. Practicing these exercises and these methods on yourself is not only one of the best ways to solidify what you're learning, but it's also what you need to do if you want to be confident training clients in the gym. And just to keep you dialed in on the exam, this section holds the biggest weight. You will have 24 questions that come directly from these chapters, so stay focused. Chapter 13, Integrated Training and the OPT Model. This chapter really just sets the stage for the rest of the chapters in this section and helps to establish the need and the benefit of having a progressive plan like the OPT model when it comes to training. I know if you've been studying alongside us here at the Axiom Academy, you've probably already been introduced to the OPT model. But if this concept is new to you, just know this is something you're going to have to master. Mastery of the NASM OPT model is essential. And when I say essential, I mean you need to know it inside and out. And if you need more help with that, we have a much deeper video that's linked in the description below. But if we zoom out for a second, the OPT model is just a great way to look at long-term program and progression. And even if you didn't dive into all the variables inside of each phase, it's really about establishing a foundation, teaching people how to move before we add intensity and load, and then knowing how to systematically do that over time. Another concept introduced in this chapter is the idea of fundamental movement patterns. NASM identifies that most major exercises can be categorized as either a squat, a lunge, a hinge, a push, or a pull. I really like this because it starts to get us thinking about and prioritizing our programming for clients. So from an application standpoint, make sure that you review the major movements that are introduced in this chapter. Chapter 14, Flexibility Training. It's not the most complicated chapter, but we introduced this chapter first because flexibility and mobility, they're kind of the beneath the surface, non-sexy things. The idea is that if we can get people moving a little bit better early on with better range of motion, we're going to be able to train with more intensity down the road. So make sure that you know what factors impact flexibility as well as the role that they play in developing muscular imbalances. I also mentioned earlier in this series that muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs would be making another appearance once we got into flexibility. And this is because these two mechanoreceptors are constantly at work regulating tension and flexibility and position. So without a doubt, your nervous system plays a big role in flexibility. Beyond that, in this chapter, stay focused on the 4 types of flexibility that are introduced and how would you progress a client from one to the next. Myofascial release or foam rolling, for example, is appropriate at any stage, but it might make more sense to do either static, active, or dynamic flexibility based upon how well a client moves. Last thing for this chapter is also to be familiar with the controversial stretches that are introduced. And now in chapter 15, we switch gears and we get to dive into cardiovascular training. From my experience, most personal trainers, as well as me when I first got started, have a much better grasp on how to progress resistance training, but not cardiovascular, so make sure and spend some time on this chapter. First up is to make sure that you know the general guidelines for cardiorespiratory training that are laid out in table 15-1. You also want to make sure that you have a basic recall understanding of how to assign exercise intensities like the Carvone and the Tanaka formula. You're unlikely to have to calculate these on the exam, but you want to have a good understanding of these as well as a working understanding of other methods of assigning intensity like the RPE and talk test. The chapter then goes on to introduce a stage-based training model for understanding how you progress cardiovascular training. So spend additional time reading the stage training content and example workouts they give, not just for the exam, but this section does a great job of laying out good cardio progression. Last for this chapter, spend some time getting comfortable with table 15-10 as it lays out the relationship between various training zones and methods of intensity like RPE and the talk test. Chapter 16 is a fan favorite. We're talking core, baby. Washboard abs and 6-packs for everybody. But this chapter goes a layer deeper. Deeper, get it? And it dives into muscles that most people don't think about when it comes to core training, hopefully to give you a better idea of where to start clients based upon their experience and their ability to control their core. First up, you gotta know the muscles. And this means the muscles that make up the 2 major systems of the core, the local and the global system. The local muscles are all about segmental control and stability of the spine. These muscles include the rotatorus, your diaphragm, your multifidus, your QL, also known as your quadratus lumborum, the pelvic floor, and your transverse abdominis. As for the global system, these muscles not only stabilize the spine, but also work to help transfer forces through the body. This system is made up of the rectus abdominis, your external and internal obliques, the erector spinae, your iliopsoas, which is your hip flexor complex, and your latissimus dorsi. Aside from knowing the muscles and what they do, this chapter also introduces a very simple but helpful three-stage progression model for how to go about programming core exercises. Review the exercises that are at the end of this chapter, not only because they're only going to test you over exercises that they give you, but also you can start to see the commonality amongst exercises in each stage. Stage 1 exercises are all about learning to control the core, and you'll see they're mostly isometric exercises. Stage 2 is made up of the more common core exercises that you probably know, where we're focused on flexing, bending, extending, and rotating the core. Then stage 3 is all about power and rate of force production, which if you're gonna introduce, is probably best done with the types of medicine ball exercises they introduce in this chapter. Chapter 17 is another one that a lot of people kind of brush off, because let's be honest, how many people really get hyped up to go work on balance training at the gym? But this stuff matters. There's plenty of research tying balance to things like life expectancy and mortality rates. But don't worry, you don't need to do 15 minutes of balance training to make progress. A little bit's gonna go a long way. And it all starts with understanding what balance is, and it's really just the ability to maintain our center of gravity inside our base of support. So our goal is really just to continue to challenge this system and its components. And when it comes to these components, there are 3 specific systems that govern balance. These are going to be our visual system, our vestibular system, and our somatosensory. So make sure and understand how each system plays an important role and what that might look like. You also want to make sure you have a good working understanding of the difference between static, semi-dynamic, and dynamic balance challenges. The rest of the important information in this chapter shares a common thread with our previous chapter on core training, and that's establishing a 3-stage progression model for improving balance. Just like the last chapter, you're going to want to be familiar with the specific exercises they introduce in this chapter, but overall the layout is going to track right in line with the OPT model approach. Stage 1 is going to be about isometrics and control. Once you've established adequate balance, then stage 2 is now about adding more movement at the knee and the hip. And these exercises are going to look a lot more like leg exercises, but they'll still have a strong balance component. And in stage 3, we introduce some power and work on the ability to land and control our body. This 3-stage progression is important if you plan on introducing some of the following chapters like SAQ training and plyometrics, and really helps to start to create the connection between balance training for athletes. And speaking of athletic training methods, Chapter 18 introduces plyometric training, which although we think about for athletes, it's arguable that just about everyone could benefit from this training, especially as we age. Unfortunately, most people will lose a significant amount of muscle mass as they age, and even more power as fast twitch muscle fibers are impacted to a greater degree. Thankfully, integrating power and plyometric exercises can massively slow this down. And the first step is making sure that you understand what plyometric training really is. Most plyometric exercises we associate with jumping and impact, but it really comes down to the 3 phases of the stretch shortening cycle. First, we have a rapid eccentric stretch of the muscle where we actually store elastic energy. Second comes the amortization phase, which is how long it takes to go from eccentric to concentric. Third comes a rapid concentric contraction as the elastic energy is released. Now that we've gotten comfortable with what's actually happening, the rest of this chapter is dedicated to understanding how we safely introduce and progress this style of training. Once again, we see the 3-stage model, which really emphasizes establishing a base, slowly introducing more demand, all before going with maximal intensity. So review the example exercises that are in this chapter, but keep in mind, stage 1 is all about understanding how to land and control. Stage 2 plyometric exercises introduce more speed, amplitude, and dynamic motion. And stage 3 progressions are all about training at maximal efforts and speeds. As we shift into chapter 19 on SAQ training, I want to tell you not to spend quite as much time on this chapter. Not only is it not tested over in the same depth as a lot of other chapters, but the truth is, if you're going to do a lot of this style of training with clients, you're probably going to want to go find a really great athletic internship or maybe go on to a higher level training. You do want to have a basic understanding of the difference between training for speed, agility, and quickness. Speed is usually no problem, but agility and quickness can be very easy to confuse. Browse the rest of the chapter and pay attention to the programming discussions and charts included for training SAQ with populations like youth and healthy adults. Chapter 20, it's about resistance training and lifting of the muscles. I know my Arnold voice is terrible, but I need to make sure you're still paying attention. The things I do to keep you entertained. So you're likely pretty experienced with lifting, but you might not be as familiar with some of the major principles that are introduced in this chapter. The first is called general adaptation syndrome and explains how our body reacts to stressors over time. So make sure you know the 3 stages as well as how this relates to programming and intensity. The next is the principle of specificity, also known as the SAID principle. Specific adaptation to impose demands. And the easiest way to think about this principle is you want to train whatever you want to get better. If you want to become a better runner, you probably should do more running. There are more types of specificity that are talked about in this chapter. Make sure you review these and have an idea of what they look like. This chapter also revisits the OPT model and dives a little bit deeper into the acute variables in each phase of training. So from a study standpoint, make sure you're very familiar with Table 20-3 that details out the suggested acute variables for resistance training in each phase. And per usual, we got a video for that. There are endless ways to set up resistance training programs, from straight sets to supersets, drop sets, and circuits, but make sure you review the resistance training systems that are discussed in Table 20-5. Outside of that, spend some additional time reviewing the example exercises included at the end of this chapter, and you should be good. Guys, that wraps up part 4 of our 5-part study guide series. Just one more to go, so stay with me. At this stage in the game, if you're still feeling overwhelmed and unsure of how you're gonna learn all this information and understand how to apply it on your own, just know you don't have to. Check out the link in the description below for more information on our live interactive virtual classroom and how we help more than 94% of our students pass the exam on the first try. Either way, we're on to part 5.